I'm your host, George, and we have with us today Chairman Kimo Gandall of the California College Republicans.
Howdy,
He
folks.
is, yeah, he is the outgoing chairman, so his term is nearing its end. So he's had about a year of service in charge of this organization. He just graduated from the University of California, Irvine. And I'll let him finish any details that he'd like to share in the introduction. And then afterwards, we will discuss his term as chair, the general state of youth conservatism in California and conservatism in general, and of course the Republican Party in California, and then also with respect to the country as a whole. So let's go. What else would you like to share?
Howdy, folks. My name's Kimo Gandall, as you heard from George. I'm the chairman of the California College Republicans statewide organization, and I'm also was the chair of the College Republicans at UCI, which is currently the school I attend. I'm also a professional registered parliamentarian, which is kind of this fancy academic jargon for I know a lot about procedure and structure, specifically procedure under Robert's Rules of Order. So all that fun shenanigans is what I've been involved in. I've been involved in politics both locally and state. So I'm really, for the past 4 years of my life, I've been heavily influenced both by what's happening, and I've had, as state chairman, the ability to influence things in the state.
Okay, well, that's definitely very helpful context here. So I guess, first of all, what got you involved at UC Irvine in the College Republicans there? What kind of started you off?
Yeah, so, I mean, I was just going to my real estate class because I was studying to be a real estate agent. I actually think at that time I was also studying to be a paralegal. So I think at that point I was actually in a paralegal class. But regardless of what class I was going to, I kind of just walked by and I'm like, oh, I should just kind of go into this club. I'm conservative, right? I generally hold these opinions. And when I went to club meeting, I just kept going back after. And more so, at the first club meeting, the current chairman, Robert Petrosian, asked me to drive them to a deployment. And I was just like, why not? So, I got stuck that weekend instead of studying, driving to a CR deployment to walk for God knows some candidate. I actually think at that time it was Congressman Knight, rest in peace. Not actually rest in peace, but, career-wise. So that's kind of what got me involved. I just kind of jumped into it and got dragged into all of this shenanigans.
Well, that's definitely quite quite actually, an interestingly not just believable, very relatable story. Like, I can definitely say that other college Republicans we've interviewed over the course of, DJ Trump, my fellow partner in crime with Shell Shock, and I have interviewed other people in these contexts, and their stories sound a lot like yours. Now, most of them do not end up leading their own chapters, let alone their own statewide organizations. What motivated you, first to take that next step and seek leadership within your chapter, and then eventually to seek leadership statewide?
So interestingly enough, I think the same thing that led me to lead my chapter was what led me to lead statewide. So my chapter, I heavily disagreed with the current president. I was external vice president. I actually did not want to be president. It's a massively time-consuming job. It takes a lot of energy. And to be honest, I'm much more of an academic individual. I prefer writing articles, being involved in research, things like that. At my chapter specifically, our current president, Mitchell Stern, and now that he's an open leftist, I can easily say this without violating the Reagan rule. Don't attack the other conservatives. He was not a Republican in any means of the word. He was not even, I guess he was a libertarian physically, but he was really not representing the values I represented. And I wanted to lead the chapter in a way that not only united conservatives ideologically, but then pushed them to become involved in campus. So, for instance, under my leadership as CRUCI president, one of our goals was to get in student government. And it's exactly what we did. There was a majority Senate shortly after I became president. We kind of ran with that. Not only that, we brought people like Dennis Prager, people who actually portrayed conservative ideological values. So it's kind of this trend of things that the only reason I wanted to be president was to change the values. And kind of when I ran for state chair, I ran on a very similar thing. I believed that the Overton window needed to be shifted. And we as political leaders, our job is to say things that the normal person often can't, and say them in a way that can then be relatable and used to further a certain policy agenda. So, for instance, one of the very controversial things I said when getting elected was transgenderism is an illness. I don't believe in homosexual marriage. And while we can have a diverse opinions in our society, I believe we need to represent what our religious values actually are. And probably the most contentious, and the one we, ironically enough, probably the one I feel most strongly about, we got a lot of trouble in the Republican Party with it, is that I am 100% opposed to abortion. I don't believe there's any case in which you can permit abortion except in those in which the life of the mother would be eventually terminated, in which case, according to the Catholic Church, I'm a Catholic, it would be life neutral. But in almost every circumstance, abortion is not permissible because, and I'm one of the few conservatives who will argue this, life begins at conception. Many of these Republican politicians, they kind of hobble the line on this one in order to appeal to moderates that will never vote for them anyway. But unless we say things like that, life begins at conception, unless we say that argument, it'll be so far outside the socially acceptable norms that argument will never be out there. And ultimately, as a Catholic, abortion is one of my top issues. So again, that was another thing convincing me. Ultimately, what convinced me to run for state chair was, at the time, I was on a slate with what became a branched or shoot-off organization called CFCR, the California Federation of College Republicans. Matt Reneau decided to pick a pretty infamous never-Trumper on his board. His name was Ryan Gardner as co-chair. And what I knew from that is, if you start putting those people on your board in top positions of power, they're going to begin to shift the values of that organization away from actual right-wing values. And you kind of see that in what CFCR has become. Nick Steinwinder, their chair, he openly says, it's not about the message, it's not about the values, it's about constantly just walking precincts for people. And as college Republicans, walking precincts is not sufficient to describe us, right? We do walk precincts. It's kind of a necessary condition of being a college Republican, is being involved in politics. But that's not sufficient. We have ideas of our own. We want to push people to be future leaders. And without developing those ideas and providing a place to offer a platform of those ideas, then we cease to be college Republicans, and we're basically just glorified precinct walkers. And that's not what I stand for. That's not what happened. And I think when I initially became involved in state politics, it's because prior to kind of all this drama of me running for office, Ariana Rowlands, who was running, was very much into the idea that we can't only be glorified precinct walkers. So that's kind of what warped me into this. I have a view that college students are more than just slaves to the Republican Party. Obviously, I love the Republican Party. We never say anything bad on that point. But you kind of get the point, right? We're more than that. We can actually play a part in advocacy, in changing campus discourse. And really, a lot of these advocacies originate on college campuses. So we are the first line of defense against leftism, because I'll be totally frank with you, a lot of the boomers don't understand the ideas, right? They just kind of respond with this very typical Cold War response with, socialism bad. Well, yes, socialism is bad, but explain why it's bad. Explain the implications. Explain why it destroys and deteriorates families. So college students need to be on the front line of defending us from leftist discourse, because ultimately their goal is to pervert the truth and then to translate the university system into something that is for, shedding light on the truth and becoming something more of a social activist training program, which is what they are aiming to become now. And when the university says change the world, what they're really saying is change the world in our Marxist paradigm. That's really what their goal is. We especially see that so there's kind of these interesting dichotomies that open up across the state. Of course, I would love to privatize education because then we can Christianize it again, which is ultimately what I think the conservative response has to be, that this public secular education lends to a worldview that is not conservative because it devalues certain things which we assume are important. But that's kind of a tangent on how both my ideology and what convinced me to run. And kind of the summary of this is I didn't like the people in power or the people who could have been in power, so I decided to take a stance against them because many people urged me to and because no one else would. I was really here out of necessity, not because I wanted it. In fact, if I could go back in time and convince someone else to run for chair, I would have done it. Because honestly, it's been such a drain. Politics just drains you. It's a sacrifice. If you're a good chair, you're the time I spent fundraising, I could have been benefiting myself. But it's really a thankless job.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's actually a very good descriptive answer. Thank you for going into that level of detail. And I think that one thing that I'd like to highlight that Chairman Gandall said is that he mentioned the whole issue of boomers not understanding issues. Now, I will say that this is not always true. It is true often, though, and I think that's important. It's important to note how often it is true because it's actually a big problem. I think if you go on Facebook and you see, because that's the preserve of the boomer, and you see some of these conservative Facebook groups, rarely do they actually share anything I would disagree with or that any conservative might disagree with. It's more just that they don't seem to understand. They don't understand why things are bad other than that vaguely socialism makes people poor. Well, yeah, it makes people poor, but, it's not even that simple. It also basically removes the role of any sort of – it basically removes the role of morality. Morality is entirely materialistic, which in that case means it basically doesn't exist effectively. There is no such thing as how would you say it? There's really no such thing effectively as, socialist morality. It's all materialism. It's all about, equality, forced equality, and usually equality isn't even really the answer. Not the answer, but the result. The result ends up being inequality anyway. The people who are governing it end up having all that they could possibly want. But regardless, the end result is that you have at best equal distribution of misery, and you also, though, don't have any moral principles for children. So if you actually look at the Soviet Union and even say Nazi Germany, which was it was actually effectively had a quasi-socialist economy. Fascism was a little bit different, but it was similar. You saw really that morality didn't really exist. Abortion laws were actually only made more stringent in the Soviet Union once Stalin realized that abortions were basically killing so many future workers that the economy in the Soviet Union, which was already in the tank, was going to get worse. There was no concern about actually preventing the moral outrage that is abortion, for example. And up until the 50s, about 1954, I believe, Russia had some of the most liberal abortion laws in the world. And after the Soviet period, that still I think that has been reduced a little bit further, but it still demonstrates a lack of morality. If you look at Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the whole point was to return to this, almost rural proletariat. It was a little bit closer to what Mao did, but I would say even more, monstrous. But regardless, there is no place for human dignity. There is no place for all of these other, very foundational principles without which things like prosperity don't really even matter. And I think while I will not say that every single boomer does not understand this, a lot of the older people in the party, I think either they don't understand it very well, or even if they do, they don't feel obligated to make these arguments. And I will note, a counterpoint, someone who's not quite a boomer, I believe he's probably an Xer, but still a very good exception to people who don't know what they're talking about, Tucker Carlson. Do I agree with every single thing he says? No. I agree with a lot of what he says. I think more broadly, it's obvious that he's aware of these fundamental issues. And there are other commentators like him, probably some commentators I would personally recommend even more, say like Mark Levin, Michael Knowles, etc. They get it too. They're of different ages. Levin's of about the age of somebody who shouldn't theoretically know what they're talking about, but he does. But I think regardless, we need to point out that the average Joe doesn't. And that is where I'm glad to see that people like Chairman Kimo Gandall step in and try to, at least among young people, so the future of the party, really try to remedy this issue. Try to make sure we don't have another generation of people who just fundamentally doesn't get it.
And I mean, if I'm going to comment on this too, I think what's scarier is I think a lot of top GOP officials do get it. I know because I've been in private conversations with them. If once you become chairman, you finally get invited to all the backroom wine sipping events, and they get it. They just don't care. They honestly do not care. Their goal is to get into office. They honestly don't seem to really care what policy comes out of it. So long, there's basically two things. One, you don't raise taxes because they like their money. And two, you get into office. You could do everything else terribly, and they would still support you. And it's ultimately not even like a lesser of two choices. It's just their worldview is one of a careerist mindset. Their worldview is not, am I doing good? Their worldview is, am I winning? Am I making money? Am I succeeding in kind of this temporal vision that they have? And that's one that is completely contrary to the biblical worldview, that we should do good even if it does not immediately benefit us. And it's really this lack of committal that I think the leftists have very well done. The leftists are completely willing. They have an entire army of indoctrinated people completely willing to throw their lives out the window just so that they can, even in a little way, further the narrative. And that's a problem with conservatives to some extent, is that we've kind of abandoned the idea of direct sacrifice in our civic virtues because we've gotten so comfortable. I think we used to have it, especially during the Cold War era. We were completely devoted to smashing communism. But we mistook ourselves when we thought that the Soviet Union collapsing was the end of communism. It wasn't. And it's not just I think the brand of communism that has come about now is particularly more dangerous than the Marxist brand pandered by the Soviet Union, because now you have tribalism, which is particularly more dangerous in the United States because we're such a diverse society. Because the leftist narrative now wants you to actually kill each other because you're of a different race, right? Let's not mistake it. A lot of the leftist BLM rhetoric, Black Lives Matter, rhetoric founded itself on wanting racial division, right? When you have whites bow down to blacks, when you have these revisionist ideas where you're tearing down statues of Catholic saints because you believe they're part of some European conspiracy, right? Literally, they're tearing down statues of Jesus because they're angry that he looks too European. And it's these movements that have become all about the race, all about the kind of the state in conjunction with each other, is very reminiscent to kind of the Weimar Republic's conceptions. And it's very scary to see that abounding. And there's a lot of similarities. You kind of have this massive amount of degeneracy. Up until recently, the economy was great, right? They're like, well, it can't be the Weimar Republic. The economy's great. Well, COVID kind of threw that out the door. So now the economy's garbage, one of the worst economies we've had. The government has just decided that they're going to pull from the infinite piggy bank. And, it's working right now because unlike the Weimar Republic, we have the reserves to do that. But at some point, society is going to degrade so much to where we turn to extremist factions. And that's unfortunately, I think that's in part the case with conservatives, definitely the case with leftists, right? And to some point, the extremists on the right are going to match the ones on the left, because that's what happens. You get reactionaries, right? Conservatives are almost, as I said before, we're never interested in killing people arbitrarily. We just kind of want to stay in our homes. We're very much into social norms and politeness and tradition. But unfortunately, the left isn't going to leave us many grounds for that. And it's going to force people to become reactionaries. Ben Shapiro kind of gave a speech on this at Stanford. But to some extent, I think he mischaracterized these people because he kind of characterized them as people wannabes in their basements. But increasingly, if the left becomes violent enough, especially what we saw in BLM, it's going to be less of those kind of cringy, tip the fedora people and more of legitimate reactionaries. And I think to some extent that's why, for instance, the Fuentes movement got so powerful. It's, whatever you think about him, he's gotten a lot more influential in the past year because people are becoming reactionaries. And the one thing Ben Shapiro definitely got right is the far right feeds off the far left. They feed off each other, right? They need each other to exist. And the cycling of these both economic problems and more so, in my opinion, the social problems are going to exacerbate these trends, right? As families decline more and more, there's going to be two narratives. The leftist narrative of, well, you need the state to become the family, and the right-wing reactionary narrative, which is, no, the state is trying to destroy our families. We're going to go so far right and force people to have these families. So kind of the two narratives competing against each other are really going to begin to drown out people in the middle eventually. That's kind of my fear for the generations coming, especially as a Catholic, the fear. And we see increasingly a lot more reactionary Catholics, some for good reason. I think the Supreme Court opinion that came out today is going to blackpill people even more. That's worrying for me in the upcoming election, because kind of the conservative point was, Trump isn't that great, but, he'll appoint conservative judges. Well, the problem is when your assumption that conservative judges are going to help you out kind of falls through, that's not very helpful. And I don't know if you've read this, George, but if you actually read the opinion, which I did, it was particularly terrifying. Only one judge argued that we should overturn Casey v. Planned Parenthood, which is the current binding case precedents, not so much Roe v. Wade, despite common conception. And that was Justice Thomas. None of the other judges talked about that. They upheld precedents. And we've become so obsessed with stare decisis. I think the Bible has a great place. When Jesus is arguing against the Pharisees, I actually have a parliamentary article coming out on this today. I think some rules in parliamentary procedure are becoming obscured in tradition, that we defy the basic commandments. And Christ says this in the Gospels of Mark, where he says, you've replaced God's commandments with your traditions. And to some extent, I feel like the Supreme Court has replaced the Constitution, the commandments, with their own traditions. We've gone so far away from what the founding fathers meant in the Constitution and their natural law precepts, and don't buy into this leftist stuff. Oh, they're just deists. They don't believe in natural law. They clearly do. It literally says in the Declaration of Independence, inherent to our creators, right? It uses that terminology. So yes, you might have a deist conception of things. That doesn't separate you from the natural law conception of things. And kind of taken together, the eventual black pill from this is that the Supreme Court will be so warped in its leftist tradition, right? You have so many leftist activists that every time they're on the court, they move the court. But now you have conservatives who claim to be, judicial restraint, which is a good thing initially. But if the court's traditions are so far to the left, then being a conservative pro-judicial restraint judge doesn't do anything but reaffirm activism. So, and that's an increasing problem. They're going to force us to be reactionaries at some point. And that's what the Supreme Court's pushing. Now we have to clearly not have a judge only that's as far right as Gorsuch. We're probably going to have to push towards what is a conservative activist judge if we want to overturn these case precedents. And George, I think we can both agree we would love to see the day that Casey v. Planned Parenthood and Roe v. Wade are both overturned. But ultimately, that's not going to happen at this point without conservative activist judges. And that requires, on our part, something of a completely fundamental shift in our view of judicial activism, because we're opposed to that because it's nonsense. But at some point, they're going to force us into these blocks.
I would agree with all of that. And I think it's one thing I'd like to highlight is it appears that our justices, not that I particularly am trying to impose a religious devotion of any kind upon them, but if anything, they should be concerned about the Constitution. That's actually their job. I mean, it's what they are expected to be ruling upon. And in principle, the most charitable interpretation of precedent is that precedent is something upon which they can rely in order to have a consistent interpretation of that document, of the Constitution. However, when precedent, as you mentioned earlier, like what occurred with the case of the Pharisees and their tendency to impose their tradition that was actually at odds with, the basic, clear, unambiguous commandments of God, when they chose their tradition over that tradition particularly was invalid and thus should not have been used as any example of anything and should have been ignored instead. Similarly, I would argue, just as a first-order logical argument here, if precedent, or so-called precedent, is incorrect, it should not be it should not bind the court. It not only should not bind the court, but the court should not cite it. And if the court does cite it, quite frankly, I would argue that at least the more traditional way that the executive branch dealt with that and dealt with Generally was more when the courts ruled on things that were outside of their purview. So if the courts ruled on an issue that wasn't explicitly either constitutional or within a few of the appeals jurisdictions given to it by the Constitution, and especially in the case of the Supreme Court, usually the president would just ignore it. I mean, if you look at what happened with Andrew Jackson and the Cherokees, and I don't know that was necessarily appropriate, but he definitely seemed to believe, and the people at the time, you will see a lot of people at the time, people who didn't even agree with him, defended the concept that the president has some authority to decide which he's going to enforce. He's the executive branch. He's the executor of the rule of law. So he actually has that authority, and unfortunately that has gone away. Probably a more clearly defensible example, and also a more recent one, although slightly more recent, Abraham Lincoln. When he looked at the Dred Scott decision that was written by Chief Justice Taney, he said, well, okay, I will respect the court's ruling in this instance. However, I will not treat it as precedent, and if this instance comes up again, I am not going to preemptively enforce the reasoning given by this ruling. Now, of course, that would horrify the respectable establishment today, the idea that the president is going to take that level of authority. But that's actually far closer to what not only the founders intended, but how they wrote the documents. I mean, there really isn't – it's very hard to read the Constitution to mean that the Supreme Court somehow has this authority over what in many cases are essentially policy matters. It's very, very hard to have that reading. And additionally, it's hard to read into not only the document, but also the supporting paperwork. If you read what the people at the Constitutional Convention argued and things like this, it's hard to see this idea that somehow the Supreme Court would have no checks and balances at all. And quite frankly, aside from the rarely used and very difficult to implement impeachment by Congress, there appears to be no check on the court's decisions. If the executive does not have the authority to choose not to enforce certain rulings. Now, granted, that has happened since then, but it's been done in such a way that the executive does not get the publicity that Abraham Lincoln or Andrew Jackson got when either of them did that. But yeah, I just thought I would add that in because I think we need to remember that when the courts do these things, and if the Supreme Court has this level of, I would say vulnerability to executive check, then even more so should the lower courts that effectively are under, are lower in power than the Supreme Court. But yeah, okay, so that's probably enough.
A last note on the lower courts, it's completely ridiculous. A single district court judge essentially has more power than the president of the United States, and they've exercised that consistently, and there's been nothing stopping them from doing it. Because, for instance, I guarantee you now with the immigration thing, Trump can just tweak his plan, but some district court judge will just throw it out. It doesn't matter.
Unfortunately, those judges can issue nationwide injunctions, which even someone on the current court, I believe it was Gorsuch, wrote something about how until very recently, nationwide injunctions were almost never used, and the reason was that really it's an audacious presumption of authority to believe that you as a district court judge have any authority to impose something upon the entire country. Basically an injunction in general, for one thing, only really applies to whatever is being adjudicated in that specific case. So it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that an injunction really shouldn't be used on other cases in the first place. An injunction is really only supposed to apply to the particular, I guess, plaintiff. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, the particular defendant, or whoever's involved, the parties to the case.
It could, but I mean, if we want to get into the legality of this, a lot of them are preliminary injunctions, which is especially atrocious because there's a 4-step criteria to meeting a preliminary injunction, and clearly none of these things mean it. But again, I think it's another fundamental problem in the system about judicial tests. I think we need to separate ourselves from this insane system of judicial tests that have been set up to quote unquote balance the Constitution, but in reality have just been an excuse to ignore the Constitution. I'll give you a perfect example. Commerce Clause. There is literally nothing that can't be justified at this point under the Commerce Clause. But clearly the founders wouldn't have given enumerated powers to Congress if the Commerce Clause just allows them to do whatever they want. So, and I mean, Justice Thomas warns against this. There really has become, because of the nature of judicial tests and how subjective they are, and the fact that leftists, unlike conservatives, are unwilling to faithfully apply these principles. I wish they were, because then we could have this system. But because they aren't, at some point, we as conservatives are going to have to become activists ourselves. The left is going to force us into this reactionary state.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. I think that, and this is one thing that I particularly admire about Justice Thomas. I don't think that, I don't think he's an activist by nature. However, his priority is simple. As justice, as an associate justice of the Supreme Court, he wants to make sure that every single case that arrives to him, he wants to write an opinion, almost always a dissent, unfortunately, because most of the other justices on the court don't seem to be on board with this. But he wants to make sure that whatever that matter is, it is addressed in a way that is in accordance with the Constitution to the best of his ability as a justice. And hopefully, I wish, to the best of the ability of the majority of the Supreme Court to hand down a positive ruling in that matter. The problem is that people, and this is where I'm going to rip into judicial restraint a little bit, and indulge me a bit, both Chairman Gandall and listeners, because I am not an expert in this field. However, this is one particular thing I fundamentally do not understand. The justices and judges in general are limited in their role, and they shouldn't. I think maybe in principle the idea of some sort of restraint is reasonable, but I think the judicial restraint as it is used to describe a certain philosophy subscribed to, particularly by something that Chief Justice Roberts seems to think is his favorite philosophy, it doesn't make any sense. It seems to be basically that I believe that in the founding there was sort of this theory that you would always have the most charitable possible interpretation of whatever action was taken by either a president or the Congress or whomever else was making this decision. You would always, if there were a way something could be legal, then within reason, then you would assume that were the case so that you would not overturn whatever action was taken. However, Chief Justice Roberts apparently he said that a penalty in Obamacare was a tax, even though Obama specifically said it wasn't a tax, even though all the Democrats who actually wrote the legislation and fought for its passage said it was not a tax. I really don't know. To me, that doesn't seem like restraint. It seems like basically you are so devoted to not overturning certain things in accordance with the Constitution that you simply don't actually care what the Constitution says. It's being a politician in robes. And I think that's why I have an issue with Justice Roberts, particularly, but also with that philosophy in general, because so many people defend it. Lower court judges occasionally do the same, or often rather do the same thing, but it usually isn't publicized.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people in the Republican Party, a lot of, so-called conservative legal scholars who claim that, he's just doing it for that reason. And also, to attempt to prevent court packing or whatever. My view on that is simply that that's not his role. It's not your job. Your job is to apply the Constitution. And if it means you risk court packing, then that's society's problem to manage. You need to do your job. I mean, that's my view.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, so technically speaking, judicial restraint just means if you're not going to intervene against government action. So technically speaking, Justice Roberts was practicing that. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right. He was only doing so because it happened to meet his political ideology. And we see that now when contrasting it, he was all into making it fit what the government felt now. And now you contrast it to the Civil Rights Act, where, Civil Rights Act unequivocally was to stop segregation. That was basically the line item point that Congress created it for. But now it's been perverted to mean transgender rights, right? To basically infringe on people's religious freedom, which is not what 1960s Congress believed. I mean, 1960s Congress, the majority of them probably still up front disagreed with gay marriage. But now they suddenly think, it's the textualist philosophy to approach it. And I think Alito was perfectly said it in his dissent on that civil rights case recently published, that the left has attempted to basically under he used the term pirate ship, to pirate the word textualist and transform it to their own meaning. And the reason is, to the left, language changes so often, it's whatever societal norms are. And of course, societal norms are whatever you want it to be. Whoever's the most angry standing in front of the Supreme Court screaming, apparently. Because apparently it worked out when, Senator Chuck Schumer went in front and started ranting about what, if the Supreme Court's going to be in big trouble if they overturn abortion rights, yada, yada, yada. And he got his way, because to these people, it's not about being faithful to what the people writing the document meant, or more importantly, what the document actually says, but whatever society's screaming loudest about at that point. And it's really a disgusting and perverse ideology. And unfortunately, I would say probably up until this year, I've still been hope that we can have some judicial restraint. But I'm beginning to kind of take the black pill on that. And what I'm basically convinced of now is there is no hope for a future conservative America that has judicial restraint involved. Activism is going to have to be a component. I know I, as a judge, would try to minimize my activism, but I'm going to have to recognize there's some precedents that is just so bad, so perverse, so wrong, that we're not going to be able to hold consistent ideologies on that. So I think what really needs to be the new rhetoric is not activism versus restraint, but more so originalism and holding the doctrines of textualism up. Because ultimately, what I want to see out of future Supreme Court justices is not if they're going to uphold precedents, but if they're going to uphold truth. Honestly, if I was a senator, I'd have a simple question for them, and it'd be, what's more important, the truth or case precedents? And if their answer is case precedents, then, chop and block. No, because at that point, even if they, cite their conservative credentials with the Federalist Society or whatever, it doesn't matter, because they'll just end up like another Gorsuch or Kavanaugh arguing that they want whatever the leftist piece of legislation has to be. And it's the ultimate problem behind this. I think it's even more absurd that we can't repeal DACA for whatever absurd reason. It has to do with a public administrative act, when in reality, it's an executive order, and the executive officers should be able to overturn it with whatever power they want. So I think it's just patently absurd to me that we're creating these systems where the court is essentially more powerful than an act of the president, or to some extent, even Congress. They can just pervert the words to be whatever they want.
Yeah, and I think that's also very important to mention. And to clarify, earlier I was really mentioning that not that Chief Justice Roberts isn't practicing judicial restraints, but rather that I don't agree with judicial restraint, at least as he practices it, in that I think in principle, obviously, ceteris paribus, it's better that you do not interfere with the actions of the executive, or especially the legislature. However, at the end of the day, your job is to defend the Constitution. I mean, that's and unfortunately,
this has been an age-long argument, George. It's been the argument of, are you going to uphold tradition, or are you going to uphold God's commandments? And in this case, the Constitution would be the commandments. And the case time and time again. Again, I love Stanford, but you guys kind of are part of that, Ivy Tower, despite the fact of you're not actually an Ivy League school. But regardless, these high-level academics think their traditions are more important than their actual commandments. And I think that's a philosophical debate that we need to have as conservatives, because it's one that's harming us tangibly.
That's actually a very good point. So I think one thing, just in order to change the conversation a little bit, to some things that I think you are uniquely positioned to comment on. What do you think the future is of the conservative movement, not just in California, but among, people maybe roughly, your age, as, people who are currently young people, recently out of college or in college or maybe in high school right now? And how is that looking in California and also across the country? And what is the best way to promote that? And how has your time, in college Republicans informed that view, interpretation, and knowledge?
Well, I think as chair, I hate to leave on a black pill, but that's kind of what I'm going to give you, because that's my honest opinion. I think, as I have reiterated before, unfortunately, the left is going to force a lot of college Republicans. It's going to force a lot of people into the next generation of conservative movement to be one of two things. Either they're going to be Democrat lights, which is not much better than leftists. They're a little better, but they're generally complacent. They're basically Joe Bidens. Or they're going to be reactionaries. And I don't want us to be reactionaries. I don't want to engage in these ever more extreme ideas, but it's going to grow there as the left begins to impose more. I think at some point along the line, there will be a serious Bernie Sanders socialist president that will basically just view the Constitution as insignificant. And when, I'm not pandering the boogaloo or things like that, but I think to some extent conservatives are going to begin to reject the status quo more like leftists are now. And you're going to see that violent reactionary tendency arise. That's what leftists are now. What's even worse about leftists is they're not reactionaries. They don't need to be reactionaries. They control the status quo, and yet they're still violent. And at some point, conservatives are going to defend themselves. And, I view that as an unfortunate side effect of the fact your wealth, your property, your guns, all your rights. They won't be happy. And we have to understand that. That's the fundamental problem. And until we moderate them, at least get them to see, well, maybe a communist America isn't the right path to go. We're going to increasingly see these ideologies abound. And they'll become increasingly popular because, and I think Ben Shapiro kind of put this the best way. The larger that the status quo, particularly leftists, hold a discrepancy between what they argue and what they establish in education and just obvious reality, is the more extreme people on the right are generally going to become. Because it'll be easier and easier to make the argument that you're just being lied to, that all the institutions are illegitimate. And when institutions become illegitimate, then increasingly there's no incremental path to policy change. There's no incremental path to get your way in society. And unfortunately, we're beginning to see that. I think we're eventually in the future going to see a major classing of left and right. And it's going to be in some ways violent. Hopefully it won't, involve another civil war. But I do think we're going to see major social change comparable to the 1960s. Now, moving on, what do I think the future California is? Not a good one, not a bright one. I have a lot of disagreements with what the current party is approaching. The current party, I'll just put it this way, is not very reflective of true conservative values, right? I'll give you a perfect example. They're posting on Twitter, they're posting on Facebook, the black square. And what they don't get is it's not about, the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. It's not about that. It's fundamentally not about police reform. It's fundamentally not about any of that. It's not about incremental reform. It's about a fundamental shift in society. And I can summarize it for you. And it's really simple and it's scary. And to some extent, it reflects what these reactionaries are saying. And it's literally white person bad, particularly white male bad. That's the blanket summary. And it's a scary summary, but it's a summary they're arguing in universities, right? With the fact that perfectly innocent white people have to apologize for things they were not involved in implies increasing tribal tendencies. And tribalism inevitably will lead to an alienation of the other. And the other in this case will be white people. I'm not going to make it simple, or I'm not going to make it obfuscated like a lot of politicians will. But in California, they are trying to literally create discriminatory mechanisms comparable to segregation for white people. How do we see that? Well, the first most obvious one is they're trying to literally repeal the equivalent of the Civil Rights Act, except in California's code. They're literally trying to repeal that the government can't discriminate along lines of race, which will allow them to have affirmative action. But affirmative action means a lot of things. I'll give you the first one it means. At almost every UC campus, and this has been talked about in academic circles and student government circles, that they're going to have black-only housing, right? Segregation. But more so, they're going to appropriate more resources to that because, this group was disadvantaged. But what that ends up being is just a form of 1960s segregation, reversed. And that's not better. That's not helping a disadvantaged group. That's creating divisiveness amongst racial lines. And at that point, again, we have the even just as scary reactionary tendency from the right, where again, the discrepancy is growing, right? Because the left, even after they appropriate these extra resources, have more affirmative action policies, are pumping 80% of the university's funds towards Black and disadvantaged students, that the white straight students are still going to be told, you're advantaged, you're privileged, everything that's wrong in society is your fault. And they'll see the discrepancy grow, and it'll drive them into more extreme circles. And it's not their fault, honestly, because they're kind of right in that California and the California Democrats are coming after white people unambiguously. Also Asians. Asians will honestly probably be the ones who are immediately most harmed by the policy, because they make up the majority of the university system and will be seen as collaborators with the white people. And it's honestly, it's tragic, because we want policy that's going to include everyone and create equality to some extent, at least equality under the law. And leftists, unambiguously, once again, don't want that. They want these tribalistic divides that will make America end up looking something like the segregationist South. California, it's already moving that way, and it'll be that way soon.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very solid analysis. All that I might add is that I have been observing the California situation. I think that it definitely they're declaring war on anyone who's not what they call a URM, or an underrepresented minority. So that would mean, yeah, I mean, yes, white people, obviously, Asians as well. I think the broader problem here is that this is my personal view. Of course, people have different views. I don't really think it's the government's job to tell, say, a university that is entirely independent, which really pretty much is just Hillsdale College. I can't think of anywhere else that doesn't get government grants. But, I don't think it's that. I think if you're truly not taking taxpayer dollars, okay. Even in private institutions that do but aren't at least funded, that I can understand the argument that maybe you want to be affirmative action, whatever. I don't believe it's right, but I believe it is your right as a state institution, and that's what this law is about. That's what ACA 5, or is this ACA 5? Does that also?
It's ACA 5, yeah. It's striking the constitutional protections that the government cannot discriminate along racial lines.
And didn't it also add, I believe, basically an anti-white curriculum to the public schools?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, that's another thing that I think is important. We forget, people talk a lot about Saul Alinsky's impact in propelling the left forward. I think we talk too much about Saul Alinsky. We don't talk enough about Howard Zinn. How did Howard Zinn have an impact? He wrote A People's History of the United States, a very shoddily researched, inaccurate, and downright, I would say, dishonest review of U.S. history that basically presents all white people, all successful people of any color, really, and basically anyone who promoted Western civilization in the United States as some sort of racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobe, insert all the buzzwords, but also somebody who was just motivated by the desire to oppress people for personal gain. And I would say that the fact that most people haven't read his book, but the point, it's more that those ideas have formed the core of historical revisionism in the U.S. So even though you haven't read his book, chances are you've effectively read his book and all of these textbooks you've had for your K through 12 and even college coursework in history and in any sort of cultural things. When the Boy Scouts, well, no, they're not the Boy Scouts anymore. They're Scouts BSA because they have girls in them now. But when the Scouts decide that they're going to have a required American Diversity Merit badge to get their highest rank of Eagle, then you know that basically society's been conquered by the, revisionists, the people who don't understand their history. When people are tearing down statues of Father Junipero Serra, who was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church and who defended the Chumash and other tribes from Spanish soldiers' abuse and actually educated them as well, and they're calling him a racist or a white supremacist or a genocidaire. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. These people at best are phenomenally stupid. At worst, they know better and they're doing this evil anyway. I guess the point here is that we forget about how the impact of education. So though it is equally important that now, not just in universities, but probably in public hiring, also in California, there will be racial discrimination that entrenches anti-white and probably as well anti-Asian bias. There will also be especially anti-white bias in the public education system, so that everyone, so just as and this is a legitimate complaint that a lot of black people had in the past, that in some schools, black people were demonized in some old curricula that were equally inaccurate. These kids were taught to hate themselves. You're going to have the same dynamic with white children today in California. They will be taught, and I would say probably honestly to some extent, and ironically, given the racism against Asians in California for a long time, you'll probably have to some extent Asians be taught that, oh, you're privileged, you should feel bad. And the problem is that that's not only is it inaccurate and is based in lies, but it's also not healthy for children to learn to feel guilty about their immutable characteristics. I mean, it's a fundamentally unhealthy thing, an unhealthy dynamic for them.
If it passes, George, I could already predict what the future's looking like, and it's looking like, at least, especially in California politics, we're going to have some sort of I don't want to call it alt-right, too edgy, but it's going to be an extremist right-wing perspective rises, because the Ben Shapiro prediction will come true, and the discrepancy in reality will be so great, right? You'll have these Asians who literally a century ago were excluded from owning property in this state, being told that they're part of this privileged class that's oppressing black people. And they'll see, wait, I've never done that in my entire life. My parents were put in internment camps. And they'll see what utter nonsense this is. And then they'll say, well, maybe these extreme people on the right have a point. Maybe they're telling us something that we're not hearing. And that's one of the problems when you have curriculum that's not based in fact. Howard Zinn, you're perfectly right. I remember having to read part of his book in high school for AP English, and that just kind of gets me on a different boat of, I think AP curriculum is straight up indoctrination now, but it's just anti-factual. And the problem is, how do you argue in somebody whose premise is just wholly untrue? And it's based on a premise wholly untrue that no one else is willing to object to. So at that point, usually conservatives, right, we're not willing to say people are just liars, right? We want to say, well, your premise is right, but your reasoning doesn't follow. But see, if the premise is just so factually untrue, then we have to call them what they are, liars. But
especially, I think, just to add one more part of it, if we also have solid reason to believe that they know better and they are still saying these things, that I believe is when it crosses into lying territory. I hesitate, at least personally, to call someone a liar if someone is saying something that is untrue but is not dishonest and that the person does not actually know that it's not true. But I think with a lot of these people, not all, but with most of them, we have reason to believe they should know better. I would say that since you brought up Catholic doctrine earlier, I think an interesting point here that is part of Catholic doctrine is this concept of vincible and invincible ignorance. Now, it generally applies to whether someone who has not accepted Christ can be saved if the person has never been evangelized. The idea is being if a person has not been evangelized but has lived in a way that would be in accordance with the commandments of God and has done that person's best to try to find God, the person could be invincibly ignorant and possibly saved. But the invincible ignorance means that you have encountered some opportunity to find God and you did not accept that opportunity. I think similarly, one could say that you are vincibly ignorant of, say, the truth if you could have looked at other perspectives and you could have tried to educate yourself on history, and instead you just kept the convenient narrative. And I think that that's when we need to just call these people liars, not even just inaccurate, not even misguided, straight up liars. And I think that's what you're making the point about. We try to be as charitable as we can, but you can only do so much for people. You can't lie. You cannot become a liar in order to prevent yourself from calling someone a liar.
Yeah, definitely. And I would note in my academic career, I think I've never called someone a liar as far as I can recall in my academic career. But I also haven't written about Howard Zinn. But I mean, some of these people are just, even if they're not liars, their advocacies are atrocious. Emma Goldman, absolutely horrid atrocities would be perpetuated if her ideology was adopted, right? Because she calls for the elimination of families because there's some sort of oppressive structure against women. And, she's an anarchist. And when her ideas were put forward, they ended up assassinating or trying to they did actually eventually succeed in assassinating a U.S. president. So, we need to understand these people are not peaceful. Their ideologies are not, they cannot coexist with us to a certain extent. And that's the problem. We have to see as Christians, for instance, most Christians, despite the fact we disagree with gay marriage, for instance, we're okay coexisting with people in society that are gay, understanding we live in a diverse society with diverse morality, and we can hold different morals while still being pleasant to each other. But anarchists like Emma Goldman, past feminist, historical feminist writer, don't believe that. They upfront believe if you don't agree with their sense of morality, you have to be exterminated. And they wouldn't use it in that term. They'd use fancy academic jargon to kind of justify or hide it. But I think, if anything, the assassination of President McKinley shows very clearly that these people are dangerous and violent. And that's, to some expectation, why I see the future of this country has some violent, unfortunate results that are going to come out of all this extremism.
Yes, and I think that, I guess one last question before we go. What, Chairman Gandall, do you think that California college Republicans, both the state organization, but college Republicans in California more broadly, and also just young people of a conservative tilt in our entire country, what can we do in order to try to fight what I think you're accurately describing and implying to be a very bitter culture war, both in the state of California and the country as a whole, in order to prevent a lot of these discriminatory, human dignity denying, and anti-individual liberty trends within our society?
I'm going to be totally honest with you, George. There's probably nothing we can do that would stop it. I do think, despite the fact we can't stop it, we have a moral obligation to try. Now, if we're going to try to stop it, three things. First off, the next chairman, tangibly speaking, needs to unite conservatives. We're very divided right now, largely because of petty issues, and that needs to end. And it doesn't matter what is the end of it. It just needs to end. And we need to have strong leadership. And that's not only California. You have divided state orgs across the country that have only been exacerbated now by CRs. The reason CRs are more important than just, say, TPUSA is it's not about just LARPing on campus as a conservative. It's about pushing policy change. And CRs are the only mechanism college students in the conservative movement can tangibly change policy. And, that's seen across the country, right? There's a ton of divide in the CRNC right now. They basically kicked out Washington State. Texas basically wrote them out of their constitution. Most of the southern states are completely disenfranchised with leadership in the CRNC. Some northern states even. They tried to ban, I think it was it Idaho? I don't remember. There's a couple different college Republican states they've attempted to completely ban. And it's an attempt of rhinos want to hold on to power. So we need to first unite. And after we unite, we need to shift the Overton window. And shifting the Overton window, as we explained before, means as leadership, you have to be ready to sacrifice part of your career, acknowledging that you're pushing forward issues that matter. You're acknowledging that you're going to be out there in the spotlight. You're going to take the criticism because you're going to inspire other people to do what needs to happen. So that's the second. And the third one needs to be getting in positions of government, because it's not enough just to change the culture. You need to get in positions and change the structure. And I'm going to straight up tell you what that has to be. And it's one word. And the libertarians got right on this one thing: privatization. There is no path forward for us in which public sector option functionally exists. And the reason is the bureaucracy. It's so tainted. It's so filled with this baloney. It's designed so that leftists can easily take it over, that we need to completely privatize these institutions. And we need to do so in a way that doesn't allow the tech monopolies to come back, right? I'm a big fan of Parler. It's kind of the conservative alternative now to Facebook. Their app does need some work, terrible search mechanisms in it. But that's one alternative. So We need Parler to come up. We need to have conservative private alternatives. And privatization is the future of policy change. We've already seen that has a lot of success where it's actually initiated, because it allows competitive behaviors, and competitive behaviors are not disordered behaviors. They're ordered pursuant to the natural law, because that allows them to be effective in the long run. So as long as we stop the tech monopoly and balance that and fundamentally privatize most of the U.S., we're just going to see us continue to go down the leftist path.
Okay, on that note, thank you, Chairman Kimo Gandall, outgoing chairman of the California College Republicans, and thank you for spending some time with us today to talk about your experiences and your prognoses for the future. And I will just say that thank you, everyone, for listening to The Vanguard with George, and I hope you'll tune in to our next content.